Uh, Dale Kerner, Midas Gold Permitting Manager. Yeah, I know Debbie and I know Don, so.
Austin Zinzer. I'm the Senior Resource Geologist and been involved with various aspects of the geochemical characterization program. So.
And I'm Doug Durbin, Chief Scientist with Brown and Caldwell, and I have been assisting Midas Gold on some of the water quality issues associated with the project.
And I'm Gene Bosley, Senior Civil Engineer with Midas Gold, charge of the designs for stream restoration, fish tunnel, and water management generally. I'll also be just here to answer questions. I won't be presenting, but anything questions come up on water tailings or water quality that aren't better answered by Doug, I'll give a shot at them.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Let's go ahead and get started. Are you ready?
Yeah, I am ready. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for joining today. Because we have just Debbie and Don on, and you're both very familiar with the project, I really would like to jet through these first few slides because they're very basic, and we've got a lot more detailed information forthcoming. So I'll move through these pretty quickly. But you know, one of the things we like to, or the questions we like to answer on this webinar are the following. You know, what is the existing water quality at Stibnite? You know, the natural mineralization, the legacy materials, how do they impact the surface and groundwater quality at Stibnite? We'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, what are the causes for that water quality? I mentioned the natural mineralization and the legacy activities and materials that remain at the site. We'll talk about those. How will the proposed Stibnite Gold Project potentially impact water quality? We'll speak to that, about some of the models that we utilize to predict our potential water quality impacts and how those play into our planning for the site. And they also play into what will be done to mitigate impacts to water quality. You know, what can we do differently in our construction operations, reclamation, and post-closure? What can we do to mitigate impacts to water quality, both in terms of best practices and potentially water treatment? How will Midas Gold manage water quality during construction operations and reclamation phases and after mine closure? It's very time dependent, of course, the management of surface water and groundwater relative to these phases of mining, and we'll talk about those distinct phases and how we manage water. And then what will be the net benefit? You know, at the end of it all, after we've conducted our mining and reclamation and restoration activities and applied water treatment, what will be the net benefit of the Stibnite Gold Project? Better or worse water quality? We'd like to demonstrate that it will be better. So our agenda today is to you know, proceed through all these topics that I just mentioned. Again, because Debbie and Don are very familiar with this, I'd like to skip over this in favor of the more substantive slides, but please be assured we will step through each one of these topics as we go through the presentation today. You know, generally when we have folks on this webinar that are not familiar with the project, we like to remind them or acquaint them with its location. You know, northeast of Cascade, east of McCall, very remote location, et cetera, and so on. Again, I'll fly by this and get to our plan of restoration and operations. Of course, submitted in September 2016, just a little over 4 years ago. A very good plan in and of itself, but one that has been refined since it was released in September of 2016. These, of course, are the primary components that we'll be discussing today or referring to today, and how they're, you know, spatially located across the site. Again, I don't mean to blow through these too quickly, but again, Don and Debbie are both very familiar with this, so that's my only reasoning for doing so. And here's our timeline from upper left, moving clockwise. You know, we're very excited that we are at the near the completion of the draft EIS comment period. This is certainly not the end of the permitting and approval effort. We have a long ways to go. The preparation of the final EIS and the draft ROD, potentially further refinements to the project to be incorporated into the pro or into the mod pro based on the comments that we receive during this comment period. Perhaps suggestions from the lead agency as well, but certainly a project that may still include some additional refinements. And then, looking ahead to the end of 2021, or near the end of 2021, getting the final record of decision for the project. We very much hope that we can maintain that schedule, and assuming all else goes well, potentially starting some or initiating construction activities in 2022. So again, I know I've rocketed through those first slides, but with the understanding that Don and Debbie both have that basic understanding. So now to move on to the more substantive content of water quality, and I will hand it over to Austin, and I will drive for him.
Great, thanks for getting us started there. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking today about sort of existing water quality on site, a general overview, and then talking about data collection for the geochemical characterization program and how that data is utilized in predictive modeling for environmental assessment work. So MIDAS has a fairly extensive water quality monitoring program that was kicked off back when they started working on the property. The formal program began in 2012, but it consists of periodic water quality sampling at 32 surface water stations, a suite of natural and mining related seeps and ponds, as well as an extensive network of alluvial and bedrock monitoring wells, sort of at various locations on the site, both upstream and downstream of some of the legacy mining features and the naturally mineralized areas. And the data collection consists of analyses for metals, metalloids, other basic water quality criteria. Next slide, please. So generally, the key findings from the baseline water quality monitoring work are that arsenic and antimony are two of the metals of primary concern that are found to be elevated in surface water and groundwater on the Stibnite site, especially elevated downstream of legacy mining impacts. And these legacy mining features are thought to be the principal sources of metals entering surface water. The water quality data from non-mining impacted areas that are naturally mineralized, where there's natural gold mineralization, also tend to have elevated metal concentrations, which is really important for putting this information in context. And then another important finding is that there's really no evidence of any acid rock drainage issues on site. We tend to have circumneutral conditions found in the majority of water samples on site. And then just finally, I think it's important to keep in mind that in surface water, arsenic and antimony actually show an inverse relationship with stream flow, so that we have our highest metal concentrations in the summer and periods when there isn't very much water in the streams. This is a photo of the DMEA adit, which is one of the many underground tunnels and former mine working areas on site. And seepage coming directly from some of these adits is one of the types of impacts that we see from some of the legacy mining features. The other major type of impact is from some of the historical waste rock dumps and sort of exposed mine spoils piles, especially the SODA, the spent ore disposal area, and the underlying Bradley tailings disposal area, where there's over 10 million tons of material in an unlined facility in Upper Meadow Creek. So we're going to be looking at some plots on the next couple of slides that show the water quality and how it changes going from upstream in Meadow Creek. And you can see a nice photo of Upper Meadow Creek in the lower left, and how the water quality changes as it flows past key mining features such as the soda, the mill and smelter site, and then down through the Yellow Pine pit along the East Fork, which is pictured in the upper left. And then finally through the confluence with Sugar Creek. On the map on the right, you can see some yellow bars, which indicate some of the locations that we're going to be looking at water quality. This first slide is showing a summary of the baseline arsenic concentrations measured from upstream on the left to downstream on the right. And the different colored bars indicate the median and the upper quartile and the minimum and maximum of the arsenic concentrations. And what you can see, and also the red line on the bottom, that's the human health criteria of 10 micrograms per liter. What you can see is that throughout most time periods and also most locations, arsenic is consistently elevated above the Idaho human health criteria. Similar story for antimony. You can see that it is pretty much consistently elevated above the human health criteria of 5 micrograms, and that it sort of increases steadily downstream with a major increase downstream of the Yellow Pine pit above the confluence with the East Fork, where it's above the confluence with Sugar Creek, where Sugar Creek waters end up diluting the concentration down. Mercury is slightly different. You can see that mercury really remains below the chronic criteria of 12 nanograms all the way down until below the confluence with Sugar Creek. And this reflects the fact that Sugar Creek, which drains the Cinnabar area and the eastern part of the district that's naturally mineralized with mercury mineralization, introduces a lot of mercury into the East Fork, South Fork, below its confluence with the upper East Fork. So we talked about some of the legacy mining features that are impacting water quality. Another source of impacts to water quality are some of the naturally mineralized areas on the project site. This map on screen shows some of the arsenic and soils data from the exploration database, and you can see that it delineates a broad region shown in yellow and red that's elevated in arsenic, which is a good proxy for other metals as well, gold, sulfate, antimony. And basically this is just up here to demonstrate the fact that there's a broad area of naturally occurring mineralization in the Stibnite mining district, which is what makes it such a well-endowed mineralized area, the focus of mining for over 100 years. And that this natural mineralization basically contributes elevated metal concentrations to surface and groundwater in the district. So back around 2000, IDEQ solicited a consultant to do a characterization study of the district for some circular related work. And consultant came up with some estimates of what natural metal concentrations in groundwater and seepage from mineralized areas are. That's shown on this plot here. You can see that their estimates for arsenic were 30 to 150 micrograms per liter, which is consistently above the Idaho human health criteria. Antimony was a little bit lower in groundwater, but antimony was found to be naturally elevated above various criteria in seepage from mineralized areas. So just important to keep in mind that that the sources of metal in surface and groundwater on site are the result of both mining related features as well as naturally occurring mineralization found in the rocks in the area. So I think if Debbie or Don have any questions, this would be a good time to stop for questions. But if not, I'll jump in and talk briefly about the geochemical characterization study. This is a study that was designed to collect data for use in environmental modeling. And it consisted of a suite of rock samples from both legacy mining wastes and rocks that are planned to be mined as part of the Stibnite Gold Project, in addition to some of the other materials on site. And the samples were submitted for multi-element chemistry and for various leaching procedures to assess their the rate at which they might release constituents of concern into the environment. This plot is showing the data from the phase 1 humidity cell test program, in which the rocks are subjected to alternating cycles of dry and moist air to sort of mimic natural weathering conditions. These tests are typically run for about 40 weeks. But for the Stibnite project, we ran these tests for over 140 weeks, which is much longer than is typically necessary. And throughout this time period, what you're seeing on this plot is that the leachates from the cells remained consistently, above pH 7 throughout that entire time period, as shown on the vertical axis there. And this is just some additional evidence that that there isn't really an acid rock drainage issue associated with geological materials on the Stibnite site. This is a slightly different plot showing the same information, really, but this is plotting net neutralization potential against neutralizing potential ratio. But basically what it means is that the materials falling in the green box, which constitute the majority of the samples, they have more carbonate available to buffer acid than they do have sulfide minerals available to produce acid. So you look at the balance of these, and these are all deemed to be non-potentially acid generating. The samples falling in the orange box, those are potentially acid generating. And this reflects the fact that they have more sulfur than they do carbonate. However, what I want to point out on this plot is that the majority of the samples in the orange box are actually ore grade. They're colored red, you can see on the plot. And these are materials that are planned to be processed through the mill, which will effectively neutralize them by mineral processing. So this is just some additional evidence pointing to the fact that we don't believe that acid rock generation is going to be an issue with geological materials on this site. We do have evidence for circumneutral metal leaching on site, and this is consistent with elevated concentrations of arsenic and antimony observed in surface water downstream of some of the legacy mining materials. These are processes that release metals into the environment without under circumneutral conditions, so without the acid rock drainage part of ARD. And other elements that are potentially released at concentrations that may exceed certain criteria include aluminum, manganese, selenium, and sulfate. Yeah, and as I said, these are consistent with observations. So, and this information is all being utilized in some of the environmental modeling. I think can click a couple times on this one. So I just wanted to, this slide basically just demonstrates how some of the various environmental models interact with each other. On the right, you can see that the site-wide water chemistry model, which is the model that's used to guide predictions about water chemistry under different mining scenarios. This is based on these other inputs, such as the site-wide water balance, the stream and pit-like temperature model, and the hydrologic model. This is my last slide, but it shows some of the results from the site-wide water chemistry model for the post-closure period following mining under some of the various alternatives, project alternatives that are being examined as in the DEIS. But the take-home point here is that we have mining impacts and natural background activities, plus all the restoration activities that are planned as part of the project are predicted to result in a net improvement in surface water quality, at least for some of the alternatives, including alternative 2, which you can see with the purple line. You can see that the water quality associated with alternative 2 is reduced below current conditions, which is shown in the green line there. So I think this pretty much wraps it up. And I'm going to hand it off to Doug, who's going to talk about some additional improvements that were made to improve upon the results that we just saw.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Austin. Yes, I'm going to talk about, maintaining good water quality and ensuring that that Midas Gold achieves its goal of protecting and in some cases improving water quality at the site. As a major vehicle toward demonstrating that, Midas Gold put together a document earlier this year called the Water Quality Management Plan, and that plan was then submitted to EPA and to the Forest Service and the other reviewing agencies, not just for them to digest it, but we actually got feedback from them and incorporated that feedback into the final version of that plan. And although I say final, that document has been finalized, but there is still ongoing work to provide sort of a broader view of overall water management, and then the water quality management plan sits within that overall water management plan that is still being fine-tuned at this point. The first bullet there, I think, is the key one, and that is that the overall goal is to be sure that the mine project complies with the Clean Water Act, and we're shooting for a net improvement in water quality at the site. The plan provides for managing and in some cases treating the mine impacted water before it's released back into surface waters. It's important to realize that there's quite a bit of water that is involved in this mining process, and there's a lot of water that is necessarily used in the process. A bunch of that water will be water that's collected from the site, runoff from some of the mine facilities. There will be some groundwater that's used to keep the pits dry and mineable, and that water goes into the process rather than having to be discharged. So one of the primary things that happens to keep the surface waters of the site clean is to be using and reusing and recycling as much water as possible. So when we talk about managing and treating water, the treatment is provided only on that portion of the water that goes back to the environment, which is really a minority of the water for the overall program. I'm going to talk a little bit about the construction period, the operations period, and reclamation and post-closure. All of those are considered in the water quality management plan. The plan was actually developed around alternative 2 in the draft EIS, and yet it can be adapted to any of the other alternatives, or if there are refinements made to alternative 2, it could be applied there as well. So it was intentionally created to be something that's adaptable. And as I said a minute ago, we did get comments back from EPA on their thoughts on the initial draft and incorporated consideration of those thoughts. Can you guys hear me? I have a note on my screen that says my sound isn't working.
You're good.
Okay, all right. So the water management objectives, we want to protect the surface water and groundwater quality during operations, but also during construction and during the post-closure period. And over the long term, we want to see an improvement in water quality. And so one piece of that, which isn't necessarily thought of typically as a water quality, a chemical constituent, but temperature is of great importance in many streams in Idaho because of the salmonid populations there. So we have spent a lot of time thinking and creating some engineering solutions to minimize any impacts of unacceptable temperature changes to protect those fisheries. Okay. All in all, when we think about protecting the environment, it kind of revolves around 3 ideas. The first thing is that you want to avoid as many impacts as you can. So do what you can to keep clean water away from contaminated or even potentially contaminated water to avoid having a degradation or an impact. The next step is to minimize. You want to look at where you do have some potential effect. How do you keep it from being sort of the worst case situation and try to make it the best case? So instead of a lot of contamination, you have small amounts of contamination that you can handle. And then the third step is to mitigate for any impacts that you have that would exceed, let's say, state water quality criteria or protective thresholds for some of the aquatic species in the area. To do all 3 of these things, you can see that the blue cloud there in the upper right corner, you want a plan that can be adapted to changing situations. And I've worked on many mine programs, and they last multiple years. mines necessarily change through their life. Some parts of the mine get bigger. Other parts of the mine, as the mining finishes up, they go back to a beneficial situation for post-closure. So all of those changes mean that you have to respond. You won't treat water in the 4th year the same way that you treat water in the 1st year. So adaptive management is built into this entire process. Okay. So here we've kind of turned the Earth around a little bit. This is looking at the site so that the left-hand side of the screen is to the south and the right-hand side of the screen is to the north, but it lets us kind of look at the overall pathway through the Stibnite Valley, if you will. And so if you just sort of keep that configuration in your mind as we go through some of these other slides, remember that water generally goes downhill, and so we're trying to manage it so that the water is helped along by gravity as much as possible, and that Midas Gold takes advantage of pumps and pipes when necessary to get the water to some other places. Okay. One of the key things that we do to keep the clean water clean is to make sure that we catch the water that's coming down the hillsides before it gets to an area that contains mine facilities or mine materials. So this is a zoom in on a part of the tailing storage facility and also the buttress that will protect it and hold it in place. If you see the light blue lines that run along each side, those are what we call diversion channels. Those are actually cut into or graded into the hillside so that the water, represented by those blue arrows, as the water comes down the hillside, it doesn't get all the way to the tailing storage facility and potentially become contaminated there. Instead, it's captured and runs then downhill along the hillside, and it can rejoin the stream without picking up any mining contamination. So this kind of diversion channel is used around many of the different facilities at this mine site and many, many other mine sites. Also, what you see on here, the label at the very bottom says under drains. Under drains are used not to catch water that's seeping out of this tailing storage facility, because it will actually have a impermeable liner underneath it. The under drains are used to convey the groundwater that is naturally moving down the valley underneath that tailing storage facility. So we're still allowing, we're not going to effectively dam up the groundwater upstream of this. We let that groundwater move through these under drains, and again, it can report either to groundwater that's downstream or can become part of the surface water in a typical hydrologic system. Okay. During the construction period, obviously this is when things are just starting up, and we're making room for the various mining activities. So that's when you go in and you begin to reroute some of these surface water channels around things. You put in those diversion channels, and you figure out where you're going to need to have those reconnect with the existing streams. In some cases, there are situations where an existing stream channel has to be moved a little bit to allow for the mining. So some of that goes on early on, and you actually can begin early mitigation, as you see in the label here. That early mitigation means that you can start offsetting some impacts even before you start mining, which is a preferable situation anytime that you can make that happen. So during the operations period, this is when the mining, the actual ore extraction is going on. And during that time, again, we're still focused on diverting that clean water around the facilities to avoid contaminating it. This is the time when we're fully using that recycling, reusing, recapturing, reclaiming water. The water is primarily used in that pink area that you see near the center of the map. That's the ore processing facility. So there are pipelines and pumps that will bring water to the ore processing facility where it's used as part of the extraction. And then a fraction of that water is used to then convey the mine tailings all the way up to the tailing storage facility. That water in a slurry carries the solids up there, but then is returned through a pipeline back to the facility so that it can be used again. So effectively, any water that goes to the tailing storage facility doesn't just get lost to the environment. It becomes able to be reused again in the process in the weeks and months and years ahead. Also notice that there are, I'm sorry, hang on, Dale. There are some green areas, some dark green polygons on there. There will be some contact water ponds. Contact water is sort of the casual term that we use for any water that has touched the mining or the industrial components of this operation. So if water is collected in a mine pit, if water runs off of a development rock storage area, then that is considered contact water. It may be contaminated. It may contain concentrations of substances that are above the surface water criteria or the permit limits. So we can store that water in those contact ponds and then either use it in the process, as I talked about, or if we have more water than is needed at a certain time, then there will be treatment provided for that water. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. During reclamation, this is when things are sort of winding down. We're taking the site back to a more natural condition. And at that point, the diversion channels, most of those are redirected. You can see at the bottom of the screen here, there's a green squiggly line that runs across by the label that says Fiddle DRSF. That's the stream channel that would be reconnected and would mimic a natural stream across the top of that material, and so then becomes an analog of the stream that was there before. And the same thing happens across the yellow pine pit. You can see that it has a much more squiggly configuration. That's to provide additional habitat and provide for the appropriate amount of topographic fall from one portion of the stream to another. And then the same thing is true for the rest of these facilities as far as their diversion channels being basically removed or backfilled so that the streams take a more normal or historic route across the site. Okay. So water treatment. If you have water that has been contaminated and it no longer would meet surface water criteria or permit limits, as it were, and you can't use that water in the process, then you can provide treatment for that water. And I'll talk about that in the next few slides here. Again, the goal is to make sure we comply with the Clean Water Act, pure and simple. We don't anticipate any discharges to surface water that would exceed the permit limits. The primary permit vehicle that we will be using is an IPDES permit. That's a permit that will be issued by the state of Idaho, but is backed by the EPA as far as being compliant with the Clean Water Act. And so Idaho will generate the permit. We're putting together the application for that permit as we speak, and then Idaho will draft it. EPA will review it, and they can make comments on it. So both state and federal agencies are part of that process. The water treatment plan is going to provide information at this point for the draft EIS and now for the final EIS. So it's sufficient for them to review and understand how water quality will be managed in that process. And then the actual permit issuance will come just after the end of that NEPA process. There will be active treatment provided, and active treatment really just means that you're putting effort into it. You're usually having to put energy into it. You're pumping water, you're storing water, you're adding chemicals to water to remove contaminants. So active treatment is exactly what it sounds like. You're having to basically do something to that water to make it appropriate for discharge. After the mine closes, then there are less opportunities for contamination, and you can transition from that active treatment to what we call passive treatment. Passive treatment usually means that you're relying on more natural processes, like putting water through a created wetland system that may be able to take out some contaminants. And the idea there is to get away from having to use energy consuming processes or provide more chemicals delivered to the site to treat water. And instead you rely on natural processes that still get you to the goal of complying with the Clean Water Act, but without having to put so much energy into it. The degradation of existing water quality obviously is something that that is going to be avoided, and not just that, but the removal of many of the legacy materials on the site is expected to lead to an overall net improvement in water quality in the East Fork, South Fork of the Salmon River. Okay. As I said before, the treatment plan that we've come up with is adaptable and scalable. So it fits not just alternative 2 that it was sort of built for, but we could modify it to fit any other option that could be used at the site. Right now, there's not any plan to discharge process water. So if you ever hear the term industrial wastewater, the process water component of that industrial wastewater has no need to be discharged through the majority of the mine life. That water will be in that recycle loop that I talked about. Near the end of the mine life, the tailings storage facility will have excess water in it. That will be managed in a number of ways. Some of it through evaporation so that the clean water goes into the atmosphere and the contaminants stay in the TSF. But the idea will be that that very little water from the TSF has to be discharged even toward the end of the mine life. I already talked about the contact water storage ponds. Those allow us to hold water when we have more than we can use, and then to pull that water out either for process loop purposes, or if we have to treat it and release it, then we can do that. The residuals, anytime you treat water and use chemicals, you can end up with what we call residuals. That is, if you add a treatment chemical that pulls a particular heavy metal out of the water, you end up with a solid that has both the treatment chemical and the offending metal in it. That material would be sent to the tailings storage facility. It's already designed to be able to retain contaminated substances, and so this adds a small additional amount to that, but it puts it in a safe place where it's effectively isolated from the environment. And there will also be some pilot testing of the passive treatment options, and there'll also be pilot testing of the active treatment options that will be coming up in the next year. And the value there is that even though we have some really good conventional technologies that have been used successfully elsewhere, we want to fine tune those for this particular mine facility. And so that pilot testing lets us look at how we would scale things, how we would configure things to be sure that the right amount of treatment is provided in the right ways for this specific mine. This is an indication of one of the pieces that's in the water quality management plan. The treatment engineers went through and looked at a variety of different treatment technologies that exist, and then essentially ranked them or prioritized them with respect to their potential use at the Stibnite Gold Project. So you can see that evaporation is a technology that's very commonly used to put clean water into the atmosphere. And our engineers said, yes, we can use that, but that's not the only thing we need to use. We have to have something else in addition to enhanced evaporation. Iron co-precipitation is the one that was found as being the primary candidate for treating water there. In that case, you take an iron-based substance and put it into your contact water, and it effectively pulls out many offending metals, things like arsenic and antimony that Austin mentioned before. And so that can be the primary treatment method used at this site, but you may have to use additional things as well. And so you can see that sulfide precipitation is another option that came out as a kind of if needed alternative. Adsorption is a method for getting to ultra clean levels of water, as is ion exchange. Those are not feasible for this site. There are things that are much more likely to be used for a drinking water facility or an ultra pure water facility, not for something that's out in the environment. Membrane treatment, on the other hand, could be possible for some temporary systems or some mobile systems that might be needed at parts of the site. And then post-closure, as I mentioned before, using something like wetlands. And when we talk about treatment wetlands, we give them a fancy name of a biochemical reactor. And those are the best candidate for the post-closure treatment of some of the runoff at that time. So for the next steps, we've got this endless do loop that you see on here that effectively just says that you plan for what you're going to need, and then you run some tests to evaluate it, and then you run the next level of tests in the field, and you evaluate those, and then you create some design, and basically run that loop until you have the specific design that you need for your site. And this is something that would happen before mining, but probably also during the mine life. There would be some review of this because new technologies come along, or you end up with a slightly different water quality after, let's say, the middle of the mine life than you had at the beginning, and you can actually adapt your treatment to custom fit the water that you're treating. So the next steps there are listed. I've already talked about most of those, the bench studies, doing some monitoring, looking for new technologies, and then making the adjustments to optimize your system. So here, I'm not going to run through all these. There won't be a quiz on these, but this is just a sampling of the parameters that have been looked at in evaluating water treatment. So Austin talked about acid generating potential. We looked at pH to give us an indication of whether we think there might be a pH concern. As I mentioned, we've talked about temperature extensively. There are some nutrients on there. Arsenic, antimony, and mercury are highlighted here because they are basically the three parameters that pose the most interest to us because they naturally occur in the geology there. There's no new arsenic, antimony, or mercury being brought to the site. Everything that's there comes right out of the ground, but they do have the potential to affect water quality. And then some of these other ones we've also looked at as being of potential concern, but none of them have really risen to a level where they pose any threat to water quality. Here, again, I'm not going to go through this line by line, but this is just to indicate that all of these various treatment methods that you see in the column on the left-hand side are part of the considerations under the water quality management plan. And then you can see from the X's in the chart that they effectively cover from literally 3 years before mining starts all the way out to more than 40 years after the beginning of the program. So the water treatment is a long-term consideration for the Stibnite Gold Project. So back to just an overview of where we were. There is treatment that's proposed for the construction, the operations, the reclamation, the post-closure periods. Right now, we're looking at having outfalls of treated water somewhere near the pink area that you see where the ore processing facility is, possibly another one that's slightly upstream of that. We actually are still in negotiations with DEQ on where the optimal places are for those outfalls. You can see an outfall that's in the very lower right-hand corner. That's because the worker housing facility is there. And I haven't mentioned it until now, but there will be a small amount of wastewater that comes from that. It'll be very conventional domestic waste, you know, from washing, from showering and restroom facilities and so forth. And that will have its own dedicated treatment system that will be very much like what we call a batch plant that you might see for a small residential development or a commercial development. And so that discharge would go to the upper portion of the East Fork, South Fork. For this one, we're going to look at a little bit of the output of some of the models. Suffice to say that there are a number of monitoring locations up and down the East Fork, South Fork. They're indicated by the little black labels that you can't possibly read on this graphic. But we're going to look at the one that Dale is circling right now. It's called YPSR4. And the reason that's important is because we have a lot of data on water quality that's been collected there, but we also have modeling projections for what the future water quality could look like there. So I'm going to run through a couple of those. So this graphic, which has a lot of stuff going on in it, is looking at arsenic concentrations at that point. And what we see in the, I'm going to start and kind of go from the bottom to the top. The red line at the bottom is the strictest potentially applicable surface water standard. And so that's 10 micrograms per liter of arsenic. And then the green dotted line is the lowest amount that was ever measured during baseline. So of all the samples that were collected, there was one sample that had the lowest concentration. That's what that dotted line represents. And what we see is that the lowest measured concentration at that point in the stream is already above the criterion. So the stream is impaired for arsenic, and that has to do with natural geochemistry as well as the legacy mine operations. I'm going to jump up to the solid green line. That solid green line is the average concentration during baseline. So that's kind of the typical concentration of arsenic. It's about 6 times the criterion. So that's kind of how contaminated that part of the stream is for arsenic. Now I'm going to jump to this pink line. The pink line is what the water quality in the stream would look like during the mine years. This is operations. If you see the label for the x-axis, it says operational years. So this is while mining is going on. If you didn't treat any of the water, that's what the water quality would look like at that location on the East Fork, South Fork. If we implement our treatment program, as we run it through the model, predicts that what we would end up with is actually that blue solid sawtooth line that you see zigzagging up and down. So what we see is that relative to green line, that's the average of today's conditions, that blue line is almost always lower than, and sometimes much lower than, the average of today. So water treatment will lower the overall concentration of arsenic in the East Fork, South Fork. Now, it won't lower it all the way below the red line. And the simple reason for that is we can't treat all the water. There's a lot of water flowing down the East Fork, South Fork that Midas Gold won't ever touch. It's not part of their contaminated process water. It's not part of any contact water. It's just the water that's flowing down the stream. The only part that they will be treating is the part that contacts their facilities, their operations. But even by doing that, you can see that we will have a net improvement in overall water quality. Okay, this is the same graphic, has all the same explanations, except that this one has to do with antimony instead of arsenic. So the red line, the dotted line, the green line all represent the same thing, but the take-home story here is that the pink line is what would happen if there was no water treatment, and the blue sawtooth line is what happens if you have water treatment, again with the message being that having water treatment lowers the overall long-term concentration of antimony in the stream, still not quite below the state criterion, but that's because most of the water in the stream is not being affected by Midas Gold's activities and therefore isn't part of the treatment process. So overall, Clean Water Act compliance is the moral of the story. The water quality management plan was put together with a lot of data, with a lot of engineers and scientists mulling it over and talking with each other. It relies on standard engineering practices. There's no magic or crossing of fingers to hope it works. The idea is to focus on having mine impacted water that would only be discharged if it meets the permit limits. And I think it's important to realize that the overall amount of that water will not be very large. Most of the water gets used and reused and recycled. And in fact, the current projections show that about half of the time, maybe even more than half of the time, there wouldn't be water being treated for discharge. It would all be reused. The discharges would only happen during times of really high flows and snow melt and things like that. The plan looks from construction all the way through post-closure. So it's a full-time commitment by Midas Gold. And the technologies are all tried and true methods. There's no newfangled experimentation going on. We're relying on things that have worked before and are being used in industrial facilities today around the world. And as I said a couple of times, we have an adaptable plan so that if situations change, if an approval from one of the agencies asks for a tweak or an adjustment, we can put that into the water quality management program and make sure that we still hit the targets. I think that's the end of my slides. Happy to answer any questions.